We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Feel free to drop your name, your location, your organization in the chat, and we're going to get started in just a few minutes. Awesome. It's good to start seeing people checking in the chat. For people who are just joining us, welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Feel free to drop your name, your location, and organization as you're joining. Thanks so much for being with us here this afternoon or morning. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello. Thanks so much for being with us here today. We're going to get started in just a minute. Feel free to keep dropping your name, location, and organization in the chat as you're joining. We're so excited that you're here with us today. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We are going to go ahead and get started in just a moment. Feel free to keep dropping your name, your location, and your organization in the chat as you're joining. And we are about to get started. So thank you so much for being with us here today for our webinar, Working with Landlords While Maintaining Survivor Confidentiality. And we are going to go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about the Freedom Network Training Institute. This webinar is brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute Housing, Training, and Technical Assistance Project. We are funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. We provide training and technical assistance to service providers who are working with survivors of human trafficking. We host quarterly webinars on topics related to the intersection of housing and human trafficking. We also have a resource library with fact sheets and webinars and recordings that you can find at freedomnetworkusa.org. You can also sign up for our listserv to receive notifications. And just a little bit about Freedom Network USA. We are a nationwide coalition of direct service providers, survivors, and advocates addressing human trafficking through a rights-based approach. Just some basic housekeeping before we move forward. We do have live closed captioning available today. If you look on the top of your screen on the black bar, just click on that CC option and you should be able to access closed captioning there. You can find your chat on the bottom right of the screen to engage throughout the session. We will have space for a Q&A today. Feel free to drop your questions in that Q&A box throughout the presentation. You can also find a copy of today's slide deck towards the right of your screen. Feel free to download that to follow along with during the presentation. In about 2 weeks, you will receive a copy of a recording of today's session and any attached materials. And if you need any assistance throughout the presentation, feel free to raise your hand, and you can also find that on the top right of your screen. As you close today's webinar, an evaluation link will automatically pop up. We would really appreciate you completing that for us. So today our presenters are Andrea Sherman and Deshelle Kendrick. Andrea is the Director of Trafficking in Person Services at the Asian Association of Utah, and Deshelle is the Domestic Violence Housing First Coordinator at Angel Step In. To read a little bit more about each of our presenters, feel free to see their full bio in the original registration email. So learning objectives for today's webinar, we are going to be discussing the importance of survivor confidentiality while accessing housing options. We'll also be exploring some ways that housing programs and landlords can work together to provide services and advocacy to survivors. And finally, we'll also be going over some ideas for outreach planning to build a diverse landlord network. So to get us started today, we'll be starting with a poll, and we'd love to hear what type of housing programs, housing subsidies does your program work with most frequently? So ranging from emergency shelters, permanent supportive housing options, transitional housing options, time-limited subsidies. Other can include all of those options together. And I'm going to tap in Deshelle and Andrea to start our conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Sierra. Okay, so I see that the poll is coming in. It looks like, can everyone on the screen see the poll at this time? I don't know if I'm the only one who can see it or others can see it, but I'd like to thank you for your time here today. Thank you for showing up. It looks like we have a heavy weight on emergency shelter, transitional housing, and other. Is it safe to assume that the other is just a multiple or a few of these options, including emergency shelter, permanent supportive housing, and time-limited subsidies? Perfect. Okay, I do see it's a multiple of other options. So the reason that we brought this poll today is to describe or to display the complexity in housing and the different subsidies that are available. Today, we will be presenting from two different standpoints on housing that will assist with maintaining confidentiality of survivors in different corners. Myself, I am working in a domestic violence housing first program. My selection is other. I provide assistance with obtaining permanent supportive housing and work most frequently with time-limited subsidies.
And I'm Andrea Sherman, and so I'm the director of the Trafficking in Persons program at the Asian Association of Utah. We serve a pretty diverse group of survivors, and so we serve victims of sex and labor trafficking of all ages, genders, and immigration statuses. We are located here in Salt Lake City, but we have a statewide reach. So by covering the whole state, it really means that we're working both in kind of urban and rural areas, which can present different challenges and benefits as it relates to housing. We are also fortunate to have a variety of types of housing assistance to address kind of like the full spectrum of housing need. So my selection on the poll would be kind of all of them, right? We interact on a really high frequency with kind of all of the different types of housing programs and subsidies. So I guess my answer would probably be other, which would include multiple of those. And as Deshelle and I were developing this presentation, and she just mentioned it, it just became very apparent that we use different definitions. We might use different verbiage or pathways to access a certain type of housing subsidy, kind of depending on the state, depending on the program. And that can cause some confusion when talking just about housing, especially on a national scale. And so I just want to acknowledge that in general, housing is complex. It can be a frustrating process. It can be hard to access, hard to navigate, but it's so important, right? It's such an important part of the work that we do. So my hope today is that we won't get caught up in all the little verbiage and things that we might differ, but that we can really gain a lot of understanding from, those similarities that we may see. And so that these practical suggestions for landlord engagement can really help maybe make that process a little less frustrating. So kind of the first, thing we want to really dive into is that, I apologize. I just, for some reason, lost my slides. Okay. Is working with landlords. So we're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to give you lots of practical examples that you can use in your day-to-day work. But first, we just want to talk in general about working with landlords. So when we think back to the last slide that had all the different options, there are landlords involved in several touch points of those different subsidies. And so it might be a private landlord, maybe a public landlord. We work with public housing authorities also as a landlord type, COCs, all of those different things. And landlords just play such an important role in helping survivors access stable housing. So when we're working with landlords, I always just try to think of it as a collaboration. We do lots of collaboration work in human trafficking and just the field of social work. And so working with landlords is a type of collaboration. And so when, many of the same attributes that we might use in any collaboration we would have with a partner could also be successful when we apply it to a landlord relationship. So kind of some of those successful things are, collaborations are built on trust and a shared vision among all the partners. And so we'll talk a little about what is a shared vision of this. It may be obvious, but we'll go into it a little bit as well. And then also to develop a collaboration that's built on trust, partners really need to communicate openly about their interests, their capacity, their aims, and then negotiating those partnerships ensure that a partner form a collaboration that is mutually beneficial and that it can produce, desired results. And so if the desired results are not obtained, we also can still learn. So even from those bad landlord interactions you might have, there's a lot that we can still gain, that we can learn about collaboration, that we can apply to future collaborations that we're trying to start with landlords. So importantly, just discussions about partnerships really need to be open and solution oriented. And we'll get, again, into the more nitty gritty of what that looks like later on in the presentation. But first, I want to talk about that shared vision. So what is the shared vision in this collaboration? I'll go to the next slide. The shared vision is really this housing sustainability. And so what is housing sustainability? I will, for the purpose of this presentation, kind of just loosely define housing sustainability as the ability to access and maintain housing. We all know, especially working with the survivor populations that we do, the access to safe and affordable housing can be a challenge for survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence and other types of violence. And many of those survivors do face unique barriers to accessing and then also to maintaining as a direct result of their victimization. And so we know this, right? That, while we may all have this shared purpose to get someone housed and help them stay housed, we all play different roles in achieving the mission. But it's so important, even though we play different roles, that we really are looking at this through the survivor-centered lens. Survivors are key to the process and should really be the focus. So again, all relationships, and we'll kind of talk about the roles of each of those different circles, but it's really key that they're part of the process from the very beginning through the process and through the end. And, so it's all throughout it's key to just make sure that that is involved and that when we talk about confidentiality, that they're also centered in that process. So, so as we have different roles, there's also different benefits that we get. So we'll go into the next slide to talk a little bit about what are some of those benefits. Again, we're going to kind of stick to those three circles. Like, what are the benefits for survivors? What are the benefits for a program or service provider? And what are some potential benefits for a landlord? And so when we're looking at this, we, from a survivor, right? So if that goal is accessing and maintaining housing, this is one of the benefits for survivors would be establishing or reestablishing good rental history, despite some of those barriers that may come up. And I already had a cough drop ready in case this happens. So, all right. Another benefit we're seeing with survivors is the opportunity to potentially be a leaseholder of a property and get to be in a space or community that of their own choice. Okay, I thought I caught it in time. I apologize. It is coming along with my breathing issues. Okay, I think I've got it. Okay, and then so yeah, again with centering the survivor, you really want to be able to center that this is that they're able to choose what kind of area in the community that they're living. And I am realizing that I don't have it under control. Deshelle, do you want to jump in just while I get my coughing under control?
Yes, most definitely. So we're focusing on the benefits as it pertains to the survivor, correct? Yes. Okay. So for some of the survivor benefits, yes, we need to remain survivor focused. This is always based off of survivor choice. This will be a common theme throughout our presentation today. As it relates to confidentiality, survivors have the ultimate choice on what they would like to display to any landlord and how they would like the relationship to move forward with the landlord that they choose to lease up with. I believe that we were on the opportunity to be a leaseholder of a property and a community of their choice. This may mean oftentimes that a survivor may choose a location that we may not see be the safest fit for that survivor, but it's ultimately the survivor's choice. And we will support them in educating them and making the safest choice. But if ultimately they feel like their sense of community is in a place that may seem a little dangerous from a provider's point of view, we still try to support in all ways to create that survivor's choice and remaining in the community that they prefer. And ultimately, the major benefit for this trio or this partnership is the survivor obtaining and sustaining permanent housing.
Okay, I'm ready to hop back in. Thanks for jumping in, Deshelle.
Sure.
I apologize I have some breathing issues going on right now, and once I get started, it keeps going and going and going. So thank you so much for hopping in while I got that under control. So again, that main focus is accessing and maintaining housing. So from from the program, there's a lot of benefits as well, right? That a lot of us on this webinar today have the mission of providing safe and affordable housing for survivors. So one benefit of working with landlords would be that we can help achieve that mission. Another one is really helping us with the mission to help survivors be the leaders of their own lives. Again, like Deshelle said, this is going to be a common theme. It's going to be the broken record because we just really want to make sure that we're focusing and letting the survivor lead and guide this housing or accessing housing and maintaining housing. Another benefit is we really get to support survivors to be able to maintain their units upon program completion. And so while they may not have had opportunities to that previously because of their victimization or other factors in their lives, this is something that we're able to support through this process. And then as far as landlords, there's a lot of benefits that landlords get too. It's landlords, like their goal, they want people in their housing and they want them to stay long times and all of those things. And so by working with service providers and survivors, they are able to get consistent rent payments and maybe fewer tenant issues because that person who is the survivor who's living there is receiving a host of different services and supports, where a tenant from maybe the outside would not have some of those supports already in place. They also have the benefit that they have the support of the provider that encourages the tenant to adhere to their lease agreements. They may provide education to the tenant about how to be a good tenant. Again, all these things that they may not normally get with a regular applicant. They also will, the tenant themselves will have resources and tools necessary to be a great neighbor and a phenomenal tenant. And so there's, lots of potential benefits um, for them as well. Also, some other safeguards or enhancements. I wanted just to point out that they don't all have to be financial, right? So there are the financial, where we're talking about on-time payments, landlord mitigation funds. They have, access to subsidy. Maybe they can pay arrears if there was a housing debt or something like that. But there's non-financial safeguards as well, and that benefit the landlord. And these are things that we can talk about when we're trying to engage the landlords, right? Is that they can save on advertising. They don't have to advertise the unit because maybe we can give them references to new clients that can move in. There's possibilities for master lease and subleasing. This is something that my agency does engage in, and I can talk about it a little bit more. We can provide training and technical assistance. They can have access to that on-call advocate, and also we can recognize them, right? We can recognize them in our social media with awards and different things like that. So there are both the financial and non-financial. The one we're talking to landlords, we can really express so that they are aware of those things. But we know that, of course, when working with landlords, it's not always an easy process, and that's okay. I guess kind of just if you guys can just type in the chat, what sort of challenges have you faced with working with landlords? Is there anything that's come up when you're trying to work with landlords? I'll give it a second while people type in. Communication issues, credit issues, clients tearing up the property, not accepting animals. Yep, we'll talk about that for sure. Paperwork, criminal backgrounds, debt, qualifications. Landlords thinking they are doing you a favor by renting. Okay, so some power and control aspects. They're coming in really fast, so I'm not able to read all of them out loud, but these are all really great comments. So credit issues, employment history, not accepting certain types of subsidies. Yeah, great. And a lot of those things that you guys are mentioning, are listed on these slides. We know that tensions come up, right? It's important to maintain that client-centered approach when developing these trust-based relationships with our landlords, but there are tensions, and there can be tensions within these goals. And so, like some of the ones that are still coming in, is that we, from my experience, we have seen, a lot of stringent application processes. And when I say screen out, it's that, yeah, they have requirements of, a certain level of income, or maybe they need someone with a certain credit score or no criminal history. Like there's all these different things that it's so restrictive and stringent process that like nobody could get into that apartment, right? Yet alone some of the people that we may be working with that have higher barrier and higher needs. And so that for sure is something that we've seen. The misuse of power. I know I saw that one kind of come in about, they have a lot of power in the situation, right? They control the rent prices. They control who goes into those units. They can kick people out. And so often, or not often, but sometimes we see some misuse of that power. And so that can most certainly be a challenge. One time that we experienced this, so we do work with hotels and kind of all, like I said, all the different types. So sometimes with hotels, we'll rent a hotel for maybe a month or something, if it's an economical option and we have no other options and things like that. So we were working with a specific hotel, and although we already established different pathways about, not needing ID, being able to use aliases, kind of all of these different pathways to be able to try to protect the survivor within that situation, we had a survivor that was undocumented and coming out of a detention center, and the worker at the front desk was demanding to see ID, was demanding to read the release papers from the detention center, and sat there in front of the survivor and read through like 12 pages or something, and was explaining a lot of discriminatory practices and really making it difficult for the survivor to access that much needed service for housing. And so like that was one specifically for us that we then of course had to address. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can serve as a liaison in those type of tensions a little bit later on in the presentation. So that was like a description of a discriminatory practice, specifically to an undocumented individual. There may also be habitability issues. So the units may, they may have lots of pests, or things are broken and they're not fixing them and things like that. They may have outrageous rental or deposit prices. I've seen some crazy things over the time working in housing in the last 10 years. And yeah, there's, especially now, we see a lot of rent increases, and depending on where you are in the country, those can be very extreme. Past experiences. So maybe they have worked with a certain organization or with survivors of a specific crime in the past and have had bad experiences, and so or vice versa, like that the provider has had poor experiences or the survivor has had poor experiences with certain landlords. Boundaries, whether that's showing up and not without being announced, or wanting extra information, or we've had maintenance workers who are regularly saying inappropriate comments to people, so they're scared to walk out of their houses. So there's always potential things like that. And then lack of education. So not really understanding maybe the laws that are related to certain protections that victims and survivors have access to, or about some of the urgent needs of the survivors that we work with. So lots of different potential gaps in education. And so this is even more pronounced, some of these challenges in rural areas, because in rural areas, maybe there's less housing options. Landlords may have more power. When there's less competition, they can control the rent prices, right? It's like, okay, there's not very many apartments to kind of push down, within capitalism, to push down some of the prices or to make it a little bit more manageable. They could have control of those rental prices and kind of make decisions based on what they want. They could decide whether to accept a client or blacklist an organization. They also, if there was a breach of confidentiality, it may be more impactful because it's a small town and people talk, right? And so it may be more impactful, may be more dangerous. So in rural areas, there may be different challenges, and some of the challenges that we see in urban can even be, exemplified in those, or exponential in those rural areas. So kind of the other side of it, though, is right, not all relationships with landlords are bad. So there are supportive landlords. And when we're searching for landlords to work with, these are some things that we would want to find, or attributes that we want to find in some of these landlords. So let's talk about the positive, right? We saw some of the challenges. What are some of the positives that as far as landlords and working with them? So one of these positives is maybe that they do provide low barrier application process. So all those things that could screen someone out, maybe they have updated their paperwork to be able to not care as much, or not have it as a requirement to have a credit score and no criminal history and all of these things. And so looking for landlords that have those low barrier application processes, we often may result in more successful outcomes. Having rent controlled units, I know that's more popular in certain areas of the country, but really finding spaces that the prices won't keep on changing, in the middle of a lease, and kind of all of those things, so that it can still be an affordable option, not just, kind of whatever they decide to charge. Also providing and maintaining safe pest-free units, making, so that's bed bugs and all different sorts of things that, and there's, reputations that landlords get. They're like, oh yeah, that complex, oh, they have lots of roaches or something like that. And so looking for landlords who kind of have that history of providing those good, clean spaces. Also landlords who maintain survivor confidentiality. We're going to dive a little bit deeper to that in the next section, but that have that reputation of or have a history of behavior where they're maintaining and understanding confidentiality and practices. Also, by being non-discriminatory. So we don't really want to work with landlords that are practicing discriminatory practices. And so finding people who understand what those are and what not to do, and how to be able to promote that fair and equitable access to those housing spaces. Also, if looking for landlords that may want to participate in landlord education opportunities. One thing that our agency offers is landlord education. So we have developed a presentation where we can go out and talk to them about the challenges, the needs, kind of all those different pieces of working with survivors of human trafficking. And so that's an opportunity. So providing opportunities like that and those who are willing to take those opportunities. The other really big thing is really flexibility. So flexibility with individual needs and circumstances. It kind of goes along with where we're talking about stringent application processes, but really when we're potentially in a lease, making sure leases don't say or don't specify for residential purposes only, because so many people are working from home now. And so if a lease says that, then it may prohibit them from opportunities to work from home, and which again would affect their living wage, which affects their ability to pay for the rent. All these different things are really connected. And so making sure that survivors are aware that they should be looking for that, or that providers should be looking for those kind of phrases, and maybe steer away from providers who do, or landlords who do that. The other thing is survivors often have children, or maybe they have a pet, and so they needing to look for landlords that don't prohibit having those pets, or having the ability for your children to stay or to visit, or things like that. So all of those pieces are really important when trying to look for landlords that may have the best outcomes for collaboration. The next piece is really kind of heading back to one of those key learning objectives. And it's the understanding the importance of survivor confidentiality in this process, in accessing housing options. And as we've said multiple times already, is that confidentiality, we're not just talking about confidentiality kind of in a generic sense, we're really talking about survivor-driven, survivor-led confidentiality. And so we want survivors to lead the process, to choose their own goals, and define what is going on, what's going to be the safest for them. And so by focusing on safety and supporting those survivors, we're empowering them to be able to rebuild control over their lives, right? So that fundamental premise of confidentiality is that the survivor gets to decide when information about them is shared, all throughout the process. So we'll go into some more specific examples of kind of what that looks like. Before we get there, I want to talk about just some definitions. So some definitions, privacy. So privacy is really a victim's right to control his or her story and personal information. That differs slightly from confidentiality, which really are more the rules prohibiting the disclosure of victim information. And then also privilege, which is described as the communication between certain professionals and victims defined by statutes. And of course, the statutes may differ from state to state. So I can talk about the Utah statutes in a future slide, but those, of course, would be potentially different in depending on what part of the country that you are in. So what is the importance of confidentiality, right? We want it to be survivor-led, but what is the importance of privacy and confidentiality within this process? So really maintaining confidentiality is paramount to preserving the safety, privacy, and trust of those seeking services. So when survivors seek services, they're taking a huge personal risk, right? They're telling us things very vulnerable times or experiences that have been very traumatizing. And so when personal information is shared without consent, it can re-traumatize. It can be very traumatizing because they have trusted us with this information. It also, the sharing of highly personal or traumatic experience, it is a courageous act by them, and we should value that, right? That they were valuing the dignity and the trust that they have placed in our as service providers. Confidentiality also helps victims feel safe when reporting crimes. If someone was, you're reporting about an incident that has occurred, and you know that that person is going to run and tell 100 people and put it on put it on TV, then a person might be less likely to share that information. And so by having consistent practices of confidentiality established within your agency and within the housing process, it's going to help a person feel more safe to be able to report those crimes if that's their choice to do so. And then also, if trust is broken, a victim may never access a provider again if confidentiality is breached. So when we're building relationships and collaborations, both with our clients and with the landlord, that's important to keep in mind. Is right where a successful collaboration is built on trust, and so maintaining that trust through confidentiality is of utmost importance. So, what are some consequences then of a potential breach? So there's numerous consequences to a survivor. So it could create a potentially dangerous situation, right? So maybe there's a trafficker, and by releasing their information, that trafficker would then be able to find them, or other dangerous situations that could possibly arise. It also could potentially increase the likelihood of retaliation by the offender. Or the trafficker. Sorry, I used offender, but by the trafficker. And that's a possibility. It may also damage the person's reputation, the reputation of the victim if information becomes public. So, I mean, it could affect someone's employment, education, housing, say they're in some sort of case for custody or child welfare. And so oftentimes information could be manipulated in some of the other types of criminal cases. And so, and like I said, in those rural areas, that could even be worse because of, word might spread faster in some of those rural areas. And so that most certainly can be a negative consequence of confidentiality breaches. So, and then the other thing is really, there are federal, state, and law consequences. So, kind of as a general note, most funders do require program policies that address victim confidentiality and data privacy. So, specific to the OVC, anyone who on the call who is receiving OVC human trafficking awards, there is an award condition that does require, these confidentiality and privacy to be met. And so that is important to kind of know those laws, what VAWA, VOCA, FIPSA, and there's all different, levels of confidentiality. And it's important to know what your organization is bound for. So my organization specifically, we have funds both through the OVC and through the Office of Violence Against Women, so OVW. And OVW requires a VAWA level of confidentiality to be maintained and adhered to. And so maybe that's who our organization, specifically how we practice confidentiality and the laws that we're bound to, but it differs. And so knowing what type of laws that you do have to follow is important. And then understanding that there's consequences if you break those laws, right? And so we always want to be kind of conscious of some of those things. I also wanted to just mention that there are exceptions to confidentiality. So let me head over to that next slide. And some of those exceptions to confidentiality are, first, that different states have mandatory reporting laws for both child and elder abuse. So specifically in Utah, our statutes say that all individuals are expected to report suspected or confirmed cases of child abuse and suspected and confirmed cases of elder abuse. So we're all mandatory reporters here in the state of Utah. That may differ for your state, and so making sure you know those laws. There also are state laws that require a duty to warn. So sometimes in some states that might be a therapist, or that maybe if someone does give certain information that they want to harm themselves or others, that you may have to warn. Again, here in Utah, A therapist doesn't have a duty to warn or take precautions to provide protections from any violent behavior, except when the client has communicated an actual threat of physical violence against a person or a recently identified victim. And so there is, again, even within that, the state law, there is some um, it varies a little bit, but knowing what your law says is important. Subpoenas. So in some cases, subpoenas may ask you to break different confidentiality warrants, court orders, also funders, researchers, evaluators, and stakeholders. But if you see this asterisk on the bottom, this is also important. So even though there's these exceptions, it's still a good practice to respectfully ask why the information is needed, right? We still can ask questions even within these exceptions. Why is it needed? Can we provide, non-identifying information? Would that meet the need? Sometimes people ask for things, but there are, other things that might be able to still meet that requirement without breaking confidentiality. So that is important, kind of even within these exceptions, to understand that there's still a conversation and there may be better alternatives to the type of information that we share. So within the housing process, safely disclosing information is important. And so how we really support that the survivor-led confidentiality um, is making sure that us as providers don't disclose personal information without a survivor's informed, written, and reasonably timed consent, right? So what does that mean? So informed consent is really knowing the knowing and informed decision to either waive your privilege or confidentiality and disclose information, and the survivor must understand the alternatives to and risk and benefits of disclosure. We're going to talk a little bit later on about what are the pros and cons of disclosing that you're a victim of human trafficking in the housing process. But yeah, making sure understanding all those alternatives and that they have the right to waive their confidentiality and disclose the information, but it's up to them. What does reasonably time limited look like? So really that is, that there's a reasonable time frame given the needs of the survivor and the purpose of the release. So maybe with a landlord, you don't need a 5-year release. That's not going to be appropriate for the situation. But maybe it's limited to, could be 15 days, 15 to 30 days during the application process. It may be ideal. It could be longer. You just have to really look at, balancing the inconvenience of signing a new release form all the time with protecting the survivor. So obviously protecting the survivor is the utmost importance in that, decision-making process. The second bullet point here is oftentimes that the informed written consent happens through the release of information. So we have a release of information that we do use, and I believe that when we send out the slides, there will be kind of a copy of that. So that you can model, of course, use as a template for developing for your own agency. These release of information forms, they contain a description of the information to be released, the name, the agency designated to receive the information, the purpose, duration, and date. It also should, have a statement acknowledging that the survivor has read the form, has been informed of the alternatives, to and the risk and benefits of disclosure, understands the consequences of authorizing the release form to third parties, and then also statement informing survivors that releases of information, which we acronym as ROI, is revocable at any time, right? So even if it is for 30 days and they need to revoke that permission or that waiver, that is possible to do that at any time. The National Network to End Domestic Violence has a really great confidentiality kit. They have a ton of templates. So I wanted to make sure you guys had that as a resource. They have a ton of different templates of different confidentiality situations, of different collaboration and, confidentiality agreements within collaboration. So I do encourage you to use that as a resource if needed. So let's look, what does confidentiality look like in the housing process? So again, it's going to be a lot based on this release of information. Survivors are in control of their information. And so within housing, it might look like this. It may look like survivors, again, kind of split up into those three circles from the beginning, that they have complete control over their privacy and confidentiality. And that's through the utilization of ROIs or other types of confidentiality practices that your agency might have. Within housing, within the service provider, it is our responsibility to train our staff, right? To have trained staff, to have those confidentiality policies or information sharing policies in, established. And like I said, with OVC, that is a requirement, a special condition of receiving some of that funding is to have those things in place. The utilization of ROIs, on a regular, consistent basis, having a retention policy, knowing the laws, like what are the mandatory reporters or the exceptions to the confidentiality. All of those, kind of things are important for the provider to know in order to maintain confidentiality within the housing context. And also having appropriate boundaries with the survivor, with the landlords. From the landlord side, it's really they can do things also to maintain that the survivor's confidentiality. So keeping the application secure, whether that's in a secure place or however that looks, keeping the information safe. When that person is no longer with them, having proper disposal of their information, and again, that appropriate boundaries. Not asking questions that is this a need to know or a want to know. Sometimes landlords ask things they want to know but are not actually required, and so being able to maintain those appropriate boundaries and only getting the information that is ultimately required for to be able to process and move forward with that landlord. So that is also very important. And now I really want, so now we kind of have some of those basics of like why it's important to work with them, challenges, some information about confidentiality and the importance that it is led by the survivor. But we also want to give you some of that practical information. So I am going to turn this over to Deshelle to give you some of that really practical down and nitty gritty of working with landlords. So I will pass it over to you, Deshelle.
Thank you, Andrea. All right, so prior to engaging with landlords, it's imperative to have a housing interview with each client, because each client's choice on confidentiality will vary, meaning that your process for the housing search will look differently for each client. Understanding your current landlord network and then understanding which clients might match with each landlord is key before beginning your search. So it's important to create strong connections to landlords, and it's even more important in high cost, low vacancy markets where affordable housing options are limited, and even those with a voucher may find themselves unable to locate a unit. During the housing interview, we can speak with each client to figure out. I'm sorry, I just saw a message that said that somebody couldn't hear me. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Okay, sounds good. So I'll move forward. Thank you all. All right, so for that housing interview, it's important that we touch on confidentiality, we weigh out the pros and cons to our clients, our survivors, to see how comfortable they are with disclosing their current adversities or what they have survived from, and then help with educating them on the pros and cons, document and sign what we've agreed upon, and then again, educate when needed if we see that, yes, it may be good for you to disclose in certain situations, but if you are very protective of your past, then we can move forward with being selective and face the other barriers that we may run into when maintaining your confidentiality. So the initial approach will begin with a poll. I'll make it a little fun. I'm not too sure how to bring the poll up. One moment. Okay, no worries. So we do not have that poll. Let me just go ahead and ask you all, maybe you could throw it in the chat, how long is the average attention span of a human? The options were 10 seconds, 8 seconds, 22 seconds, and 16 seconds. So we've got 10, 8, 22, and 16. Seeing lots of 22s. Lots of 22s. All right, sounds good. So for this poll question, I will disclose the answer in a quick second. The initial approach to landlords is key to create a lasting partnership. But many Americans don't have much time to hear a whole presentation on what you can offer and what you're representing. It's important to prepare your elevator pitch. So did you all know that the average human's attention span is roughly 8.25 seconds? You have less than 8 seconds to catch a owner or landlords or to grab their attention and interest and begin a lasting relationship with them within those first 8 seconds. So it's important to prepare your elevator pitch. I would like to suggest that you create a brief overview of who you are, what you represent, and what you're looking to accomplish. Landlords can be considered business owners, and business owners deal with thousands of prospects. You must highlight your significance and furthermore, a solution that will fulfill a challenge that the property owner is facing. So we are going back to those 3 circles, right? In sales, we know that we need to understand the adversities for us, the biases that our landlords are facing or battling with, so that we can counteract any of those concerns in our first conversations. In most cases, a reliable, respectful tenant that keeps up the unit, has on-time payments, and doesn't cause disruption to other tenants is the most ideal tenant that landlords would like to rent to. And this is a 3-way street, therefore the outcome must serve all parties equally. So understanding the goals, underlying desires of each party is imperative in making the process flow smoothly. I saw in the chat earlier that many of you are saying that there's such a lack of landlords that are willing to work with the places that help individuals with certain subsidies, and that is true. Understanding your landlord subsidy preference can help you or aid you in your search when working with landlords. Representing your organization's mission with a beneficial focus on what you offer to owners is important to keep owners engaged during your first and ongoing encounters. Landlords are entitled to their own preferences when operating under their own rental requirements. Understanding that their preference is important in your initial approach will alleviate any extra time in reaching out to landlords that you know might just not want to work with a client that has a specific subsidy or a client that chooses not to disclose their past or disclose their history. Maintaining mutually beneficial efforts is important. We all play a part in have an individual goal, perspective, and angle in this process. So ultimately, our survivors want to obtain permanent housing. We want to assist in providing permanent housing and educating a client, maintaining their safety, and supporting their sustainability. And it's really important for the client to find safe and affordable, manageable, obtainable, and sustainable permanent housing. Landlords, it's very important. They're interested in finding respectful, responsible, long-lasting, and on-time paying, and unproblematic tenants. Us service providers are interested in connecting victims with safe, affordable, sustainable housing that will promote the future well-being of our clients. We can utilize our pros, which is promoting liaison services. And liaison services has always been one of the most persuasive points in my pitches to landlords. Once you promote on-time or contracted rental payments, the next concern of landlords is almost always how can they assure that the tenant won't cause any problems? This is where you sell your liaison services. This is your golden sale point. If there is any type of communication amongst service provider and landlord, there is some consent of program working with client. So if we're choosing to work as a liaison, then the landlord or the owner understands a gist of the tenant or our client receiving some type of services. And oftentimes I have a client that may be interested in not disclosing anything, but they would like for me to speak on their behalf during the housing search. This often gets me in a sticky situation where landlords will ask me, well, what causes them to be in your program? What went bad? Why did they become homeless? It is not necessarily victimizations, but enrollment of assistance cannot be denied. So you cannot be shunned upon if you reframe it in the right way, focusing on the benefit. Reframing risks into rewards is beneficial in turning your opportunity around for landlords and reducing that bias that many landlords carry with Section 8 vouchers or other time-limited subsidies. So it is important to assess the potential risks, biases, or stigmas that may be attached to a landlord that you are looking to engage with prior to engagement so that you can be best equipped for an impressive first reaction. 9 times out of 10, this is not the landlord's first leasing experience. Maybe with service providers, but surely not in general. Understanding the experience of owners as much as we understand the experience of our clients is imperative to lasting relationships in our contracts of lease-up options. Now, one universal concern from property owners is on-time rent payments. Not all landlords who own properties not all landlords own their properties right out, which creates a concern for who can best afford their rent at their rental properties. Reframing the risks of on-time tenant payments can be reframed into a reward when working with certain housing subsidies. For those subsidies who can relate to this fact, it is important that when you create any promises or guarantees to landlords in your initial approach, that you ensure follow through. You are most of the time when engaging with landlords on the first experience or the first engagement, they may not want to believe you because they have been sold promises in the past and they went the wrong direction. So it's imperative that you ensure your follow through. Anything that you promise to that landlord in the initial communication is important for a long-lasting relationship. So now we'll go into how we can obtain these landlords, how we can find these landlords. Building a good rapport with landlords within your community is imperative to building a network of landlords that are willing to work with various subsidies your program may provide. So how can we reach out to landlords in their community? We can stick with landlords that have an interest of helping for the greater good. One thing that I can tell you is that I have a large database of landlords at this time, and I'd like to say that 50% of my landlords came from other landlord referrals. So it is important to get out into a community, host and attend outreach events. These outreach events can be for housing. They can be they don't necessarily have to be in your field of HT. They can be just regular homeless events, attending and showing up, putting your organization out there can help you with gaining landlords in the future. You never know who is owning a property that's standing next to you. As I stated before, utilizing word of mouth referrals is important because they usually are your most long lasting clients or clientels, landlords that you keep in your portfolio. Now, another way that I have obtained many landlords is through client engagement requests. So I have clients who went on housing searches on their own, feel as if they don't need to, feel as if they don't need to, or they don't feel confident with reaching out to these landlords, and they'll send you over the phone number and ask you to contact these landlords. I think that at least 20% of my portfolio currently is based off of clients who are who found these landlords, found these listings, and then once I speak to or engage with that landlord on behalf of my client, I learned that this landlord also has 6 other vacancies. So now I know, okay, this is an opportunity for me to to bring this landlord into my portfolio and assist other clients in my caseload. Attending service area meetings, meetings with your COC, with your council is very important. You also will find landlords and owners that are a part of the community and keep the community first in their minds at these meetings. Cold calling neighboring leasing companies can also work for you. You'd be surprised how many leasing companies are willing to work with subsidies that aren't only Section 8. So going into a simple Google search and finding out which leasing companies are nearby you and then calling each of them to figure out what subsidies that they are willing to work with is key to understanding key to your housing search in the future. We're going to also focus on collaborating with local community centers, working with culturally specific organizations, and attending realtor association meetings and landlord events from other organizations. We all have the same mindset in realistically ending this battle of homelessness, right? So going to other organizations, landlord meetings, or other organizations outreach days can help you with finding landlords that might already be focusing on assisting in the community and giving back and providing. They have already worked with other organizations that may provide the same time-limited subsidies that you do. So how are we going to maintain this partnership and network with landlords? Building a good rapport with landlords within your community is imperative to building a network of landlords that are willing to work with various subsidies your program may provide. Landlord appreciation events like Coffee with Landlords every first Wednesday of the month has really helped me with keeping landlords feeling fulfilled with the work that they're doing. And it kind of has, I've seen it at times reframe or adjust the mindset of my landlords. They realize not only are they assisting not only are they leasing up their unit and making sure that they can pay their property taxes, but they're also assisting in doing the greater good. And I've seen it to where landlords have had a good turnout and realized that working with organizations can give them on-time payments and can also give them a sense of reward with helping the general population. Social media is another way that you can network with other landlords. Right now, ADUs are a very big thing in the real estate world. If you have anybody who is a landlord currently, connecting them with presentations on ADUs can help you with building future landlord partnerships for clients that may come in the near future. Other ways of networking include marketing materials, previous landlord referrals, developing personal relationships with other landlords, rewards for recognition, and then landlord inclusivity efforts, meaning those landlords who you can tell are feeling very good about themselves, feeling fulfilled that they are not only leasing up and getting their property taxes paid, but also helping the greater good making efforts to bring the landlord in to your events or including them in your giveaways during the holidays may also help you with maintaining them or keeping them in your network. So we'll go down into community networking. So it is important to attend all housing meetings within the community, such as your COCs and housing authorities. The next, aside from your COCs, the next community that is really good with providing housing resources is your faith-based community. There are oftentimes many churches that have apartments in the back or houses on the side. I have a few clients now that are currently residing in apartments that are owned by the church. And these are units that are more flexible for our clients that may be undocumented, or our clients that have low credit scores or have a background where other landlords may not be willing to rent to. Your PHA subsidies, connecting with similar programs when at capacity, meaning if a client calls in or a survivor calls in and is interested in receiving services, yet we can assist because we are at capacity, connecting them with a similar program can help you with building the rapport that you building connection with other organizations. And oftentimes, once you've built that rapport with another organization, they won't mind sharing with you a landlord that may have vacancies. Taking organizational tours is another way for you to go ahead and connect with other organizations. And once you get in, you'll be surprised how much an organization is willing to share with you in regards to their landlord database or how they find permanent housing for their clients. And maintaining a networking mindset at all time is important, because you can be at the mall with your kids and run into a property owner, maybe not necessarily in a formal space, but meeting that person and learning that they have an opportunity for you when you do get back into your workspace is key for helping your network. So now we will touch on how landlords and service providers can work together to support survivors without breaking survivor confidentiality. As I stated before briefly, the housing interview with each client is important. It doesn't. Some organizations have a formal process for this. My organization has a very informal process with this. We started off as a conversation, searching to find out if a client is not okay with disclosing when necessary or when requested by a specific landlord. And at that point, we will educate the client to figure out if this is something that they're interested in. If they are interested in disclosing, then we're good. If they are not interested in disclosing, then we will create a sheet of what they're willing to disclose and what they're not willing to disclose. Keeping that sheet handy is very important when engaging with landlords so that we don't go into any legal issues. It's very common to get lost in the journey of obtaining housing for our clients. It is key to remain focused with prioritizing survivor choice. Our day-to-day operations can often cause us to lose sight of this prioritization by taking the lead in their housing search, which can get risky when maintaining confidentiality and placing a survivor in a safe and sustainable place of living. This is often caused by overwhelming caseloads, lack of time to handle our day-to-day operations. So it's really important to keep that interview with each client handy before reaching out to any landlords that you may need to for their housing purposes. Again, this is a three-way partnership. So we'll go into the responsibilities of each party. For the survivor, It's important for survivors to understand that they need to create a lasting impression for these landlords. Yes, they are battling against bias. Oftentimes, maybe not bias of their victimizations, but bias of others who may have nothing to no history in the world of trafficking, but still has the same subsidy that one of our survivors holds. So it is important to brief our survivors in understanding that they must remain professional and be realistic and willing to compromise. Survivor choice is important, but being realistic with what we have available is important when going through this process and engaging with landlords. And it is also important for them to understand their responsibility of abiding by all housing regulations, because we are creating a three-way partnership. We are also, for lack of a better word, selling the landlord the ability to have a good tenant in their home. So reiterating that responsibility of survivors abiding by all housing regulations is important to maintaining a healthy relationship for that housing process. It's also important for them to maintain in good standing with the landlord and create ongoing safety planning. This looks like if for a client that has been successfully housed in an apartment unit that realizes that the neighbor next door is engaging in illegal activities that makes them feel unsafe in their place of living for themselves and their children, constantly staying in communication with your service provider is important to maintain ongoing safety planning. Some of the responsibilities for the service providers is understanding the needs and concerns of both landlords and clients. We also must identify the housing resources that are suitable for our clients, and then recruiting our landlords. Assessing housing needs is important, and that happens in our initial housing interview with each client. Landlords and tenant law expertise, it is our responsibility to understand the laws in place, VAWA laws and laws on for owners and tenants in whichever state that you're in, so that you can operate effectively and stay in compliance. It's also important for for service providers to provide supportive services. Getting housed is just the first step or the beginning of the relationship with a client. Maintaining those supportive services, checking in once a month at least with the client, is imperative to keeping the relationship clear for both survivors and landlords. Oftentimes, if clients are not being checked in on a monthly basis, and this is maybe their first or second time that they have obtained permanent housing, that this can create a vulnerable space for clients to be influenced in many different ways. We don't know necessarily who is still within their community or still influencing them. So just being sure that we are doing a check-in at least once a month, providing supportive services is a good way to keep our survivors focused on remaining in the right direction. And then it is our job to ensure on-time payments to the landlord. So if we're going to promise these landlords on-time payments, it is your job to ensure that these payments are in fact made on time. The landlord's responsibilities are maintaining confidentiality of the house client as it relates to other tenants, service providers, etc. And then it's also important for them to prioritize safety in their own housing developments. So if we see or if we receive a phone call from our survivors that state that there's always some guys that are hanging out in front of their building and they don't feel comfortable or safe, it is our job to do our due diligence in reaching out to the landlord and holding the landlord responsible with maintaining the safety of their own housing developments, maybe suggesting a fence. And I keep clicking the wrong slide. All right. So I'm going to go just a little bit quicker because we are coming on to the ending of our presentation. So just to be mindful of your time, I will go a little bit quicker. For fostering effective landlord partnerships, we're going to dive into program responsibilities a little deeper. Keeping all lines of communication open while also protecting the confidentiality of participants is important for all parties. As I discussed in the previous slide, educating both landlords and participants about the dynamics and parameters of everyone's role, as discussed previously, is important, so that we can reduce any finger pointing on the lack of one of the parties' follow-throughs. We must also provide advocacy and support to the landlord through frequent site visits and phone calls, and provide advocacy and support to the survivors or participants through home visits, and offer assistance with establishing a budget for paying rent on time. This is very imperative for those time-limited subsidies, where ultimately the client or the survivor will end up having to afford a full amount of the rent in the near future. So we'll jump into the pros and the cons of maintaining confidentiality. And as Andrea said before, it is survivor's choice. So there are some pros of disclosing, and then there's some cons of disclosing. Some pros is the ability to freely navigate the housing process amongst landlords. When we say freely navigate, usually when we are holding a subsidy and we are speaking on behalf of a client, usually the first question or concern that landlords have is what caused their homelessness, what was the reason that they got into this situation, and how can I know that this tenant is not going to create issues or fall back in those same situations in the future. And then also, it can potentially create new partnerships. So if you are able to disclose what you represent and what your ultimate goal is for the organization and for your clients, then you can potentially create a new partnership with this landlord. I know that I have a few landlords that currently are investing in ADUs and looking to only work with my organization because of all of the all of the good experiences that they have had with having a very strong bias and stigma against our clients previous to working with our clients initially. So some of the cons of confidentiality is there is bias and stigma. And unfortunately, we have landlords that once we disclose may be completely uninterested. They may stick to the stigma, they may stick to the bias. And if we are doing an informed search or a guided search with our client, that can be not so, that could be very triggering for clients to see. And they can feel very degraded after hearing a landlord say like they're not interested, after hearing what this client or what the survivor has faced in the past. Yes, it can be re-traumatizing, and it can potentially create a dangerous situation. So we can disclose that our survivors have faced adversities in the past, and then delve into what those adversities were. And then once we have washed our hands with the housing process, this can put our clients, our survivors, into situations that can be potentially dangerous when it comes to power control with some of our landlords. And lastly, for this section, we'll speak on serving as a liaison and what we can do. So serving as a liaison when a survivor is not being supported by their landlord is important to protecting a client's mental and physical health and stability. So what steps can we take if a survivor isn't being supported by their landlord? First, we'll assess the issue. We'll hear the issue from both parties and get an idea on what our understanding, his story, their story, his story, her story, and the truth. And then we can address any inappropriate actions and or behavior immediately. We'll take this opportunity to educate either the landlord or the tenant, or which is our client. We can provide mediation to, if in which this is still a seems as if still a safe space for our clients to maintain residing in, then we can provide mediation and problem resolution. But if in which we cannot, or we feel as if the landlord is not willing to budge in how they feel, and we see that we have assessed the issue and it seems as if the landlord is just not having a good understanding or not interested in understanding our side, then survivors always come first and we'll provide relocation services. All right, so we're going to go ahead and I'll head it over to Andrea for our moving over and takeaways.
Great. Thank you so much, Deshelle. There's so many helpful tips. This last section, because we really want to leave just a few minutes for questions. We've had some really good ones that have come in, both prior to today's webinar and then also during the webinar. But before we move to that, we just wanted to kind of have these strong takeaways. And we won't go as into a lot of detail with these because we've already gone over to them in more detail throughout the presentation. But really, again, focusing back on survivors being central to this process. They're central to the confidentiality. They're central to every part of the housing search, the housing, application, the approach, all of these things. And so making sure we're keeping them as the focus of this entire housing process is just so key and imperative to the work that we're doing. Having a diverse network of landlords. So Deshelle talked a lot about different ways to build that network. We're going to be sending out some great resource links, from different sources. I know I personally use HUD a lot. There are tons of great resources from the Freedom Network and their housing project related to human trafficking survivors. So there's a lot of great resources that will be sent out that you can have, additional ideas and templates that would be available. But really becoming a resource yourself, right? Is that you guys are attending this training today. And that's one of those first steps, right? Is you're gaining knowledge of how you can help a person access and maintain housing, because that's the ultimate goal. Not overcommitting, again, in a collaboration. If trust is one of the key factors of a collaboration, if you overcommit and underdeliver, you will very quickly lose trust with both the survivor and landlords. So making sure you understand your interests, but also your capacity, right? Your capacity of what you can and can't do in those situations. Educating landlords on best practices for responding to different crimes, so domestic violence, sexual assaults, or human trafficking. I know a question that came up was about, well, where are these trainings, right? Some of the, there are some, like I said, through those organizations who do provide different ideas. Our agency specifically has developed our own training that's really specific to our area, because there are differences, regionally and in rural and urban areas. So I would suggest, even if you take information from some of those websites, to make it your own. So it really is more applicable to the people that you're working with in the areas you're working with. Knowing the local and federal laws. We've mentioned a couple with confidentiality, VOCA, VAWA, FIPSA, fair housing, the Fair Housing Act, kind of all these different things. They're important for you to know so that you can help, educate others, but then also understand the consequences if those laws are broken, and be able to address them kind of as it comes up as your role as a liaison. And then really kind of, again, just only with training, continuous education, and outreach can we ensure that safety and housing needs of survivors are met. So it's not just one approach. There's so many approaches, and they kind of work together to be able to make this a more successful process. So I, Deshelle, unless you have other comments, I will leave it there and then open it for some questions. I know some have already come in. We have about 7 minutes left, so get your questions in. Did Sierra, did you want to come back in with the questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea and Deshelle, for all of that incredible information. And yes, we definitely had some questions come through, so we'll go ahead and dive in. And then we'll also be sending out a Q&A document after the webinar with all of the questions that also came in answered. So if you don't hear a response to your question, we will be responding to those afterwards. So the first question, really general, around release of information, ROIs. Are verbal ROIs acceptable, or should we always get a written one? And I believe, Deshelle, did you want to take that question first? And then Andrea, if you have anything to jump in, feel free to.
Yes. So ROIs are verbal ROIs are acceptable if the client is agreeing to disclosing their and not maintaining their confidentiality. If there are any stipulations on certain things that we can say and certain things that we cannot say, it must be documented for sake of liability. So the only time that we don't need an ROI is if the client is willing to freely disclose during this housing process. If not, then we will notate which things we are able to release, which things we are not, just to alleviate. Well, there's one ultimately for the entire program that you will be signing, but for the housing search, just to alleviate any discrepancies or legalities when disclosing. That makes sense, Andrea?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Andrea?
and I think just really being guided by, so it sounds like Deshelle has, specific rules that they follow based on their confidentiality policy that their agency has. But again, knowing what your confidentiality policy is, your information sharing policy, well, first having one as an agency and then following and adhering to that. Because our agency does require, we don't do a lot of informal, but we do require more of that formal process based on some of the different organization or some of our funders' regulations about confidentiality. So really, I think it depends, but also make sure you know your own so that you can adhere accurately to those.
Yes, most definitely. I forgot to mention that the way that my program is formed, we are really behind the scenes. So anytime that you hear a response, our checks go directly to our clients for them to handle business on their own. Most of the time, so we don't have many programmatic documents when it comes to our communication with landlords.
Absolutely. And certainly through the work, that we're doing, and even in prior experiences with direct services, always good to have that formal ROI in place, right? When working externally, just to ensure that everybody is protected and covered. Next, we have about time to answer a few more questions, so I'm going to barrel through these. And of course, again, we will be sending out a Q&A document afterwards. So Andrea, I think this question was more so towards you, just around how in the past you've been able to request housing for undocumented program participants and what your experience with that has been.
Yeah, no, great. And I was excited when this question came in because it is different, right? A lot of the suggestions that maybe we said today may work or may not work, depending kind of on the states where you live and the environment. We personally work with a lot of undocumented clients, so both in sex and labor trafficking, but more focused in labor trafficking. And so when we're working with those individuals, specifically in Utah, there are legal consequences to renting to an undocumented person. If they're, like landlords, it's called a good landlord program. They get like points and stuff if they're, adhering to that rule. And so that can be really challenging, right? It's because all these landlords over here are saying, no, don't rent to people. But the reality is that we need housing and, they're some of the most vulnerable to accessing housing. And so what we really focus on is that connection, kind of building that network of diverse landlords that would be willing to work with people kind of despite those laws that might be happening kind of over here. So what we often do is we target a lot of private landlords. We feel like we have a little bit more success with those who are renting out a room or a basement versus them renting at a large complex, because they may not be bound by some of the same rules and statutes that a larger complex might, or housing authority, or other things that like that. What we do is we do also a lot of outreach to existing landlords. So if we have a person that rents to an undocumented person, knowing that they're undocumented, even if we don't share, because a lot of times, again, the survivor's choice whether they share that information. But by not having a social security or things like that on the application, it often becomes more obvious. But if we have one landlord that is willing, say, do you have other units, right? Do you have other units available? We have, other people who could access these services. We also do a lot of networking in spaces where those who would, interact with undocumented clients are, exist. And so we go to different cultural grocery stores and are in those spaces. We work with a lot of church communities that we have a lot of Spanish speaking. And so Spanish speaking congregations, that they have connections, personal connections to other things. So really being in those spaces where you're likely to interact with those agencies. We also do a lot of things on like Facebook. There's a lot of community specific Facebook groups that we've been able to access, who are often, again, being those private landlords where there may not be advertised on other sites, but we're able to build that network through kind of more creative means. And then the last one I'll just mention, because I know we're at time, is we have also had a lot of success by establishing master lease contracts. So in a master lease contract, our agency is the renter of the unit, right? So we're the leasing, we're renting the unit, and then we're subleasing it out to individuals in our program. And so with that, we have found that there's often more flexibility of who gets into the program, right? We get to decide who's in the program. And so we do not have that discriminatory practice to, screen out undocumented. And so we can enter people in. And so, because we're already accepting the liability as the leaser, to be able to get people into some units in maybe larger complexes or things that they wouldn't normally have access to based on their immigration status. So those are just some suggestions that we do. For time's sake, I will end there, but I will turn it again over to Sierra.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And yes, we are right at time. So thank you all so much for joining with us today. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, I believe our presenters are dropping their emails in the chat, and then we will be sending out a more filled out Q&A document with a copy of today's recording. You'll also find the link in our chat, a link to fill out the evaluation will also automatically pop up as you exit today's webinar. We'd really appreciate you completing that. Other than that, please take care and thank you so much for joining us today.